organized government as follows. I have moved the State Department of Cooperatives from the Ministry of Industrialization, Trade, Enterprise Development and Cooperatives to the Ministry of Agriculture, Livestock and Fisheries, and renamed them as the Ministry of Industrialization, Trade and Enterprise Development, the Ministry of Agriculture, Livestock, Fisheries and Cooperatives to allow for better management. I have moved the State Department of Youth Affairs from the Ministry of Public Service, Youth, Gender to the Ministry of ICT and Innovations and renamed them as the ministries as the Ministry of Public Service and Gender and the ICT as the Ministry of ICT, Innovation and Youth Affairs. I have also made the following nomination for consideration by the National Assembly. 1. The Honorable Mutahi Kagwe as Cabinet Secretary for Health. Ms. Betty Maina as the Cabinet Secretary for Industrialization. Ambassador John Weru as the Principal Secretary for Trade. Dr. Joan Ouma as the Principal Secretary for Vocational and Technical Training. Ms. Mary Kimonye as the Principal Secretary for Public Service. Ambassador Simon Nabukwesi as the Principal Secretary for University Education and Research. Mr. Solomon Tutungu, Principal Secretary for Transport. Mr. Enoch Mumanyi Onyango as the Principal Secretary for Physical Planning. I have also today reassigned duties of Cabinet Secretaries and Principal Secretaries as follows. 1. Ambassador Rachel A. Omamo as the Cabinet Secretary for Foreign Affairs. Ms. Cicely K. Kariuki as the Cabinet Secretary for Water, Sanitation and Irrigation. The Honorable Peter Munya as the Cabinet Secretary for Agriculture, Livestock, Fisheries and Cooperatives. Ambassador Dr. Monica K. Juma as the Cabinet Secretary for Defense. Mr. Simon K. Chelugui, the Cabinet Secretary for Labor. The Honorable Ambassador Okur K. Yatani, the Cabinet Secretary for National Treasury and Planning. Mr. Joe Okudo, the Principal Secretary for Sports. Dr. Chris Kipto, the Principal Secretary for Environment and Forestry. Dr. Kevin Desai, the Principal Secretary for East African Community. Dr. Margaret W. Mwakima, Principal Secretary for Regional Development. Ms. Esther J. Koimet, Principal Secretary for Broadcasting and Telecommunications. Mr. Peter Kaberia, the Principal Secretary for Mining. Ms. Safina Kwekwe, Principal Secretary for Tourism. Professor Coletta A. Suda, Principal Secretary for Gender. Finally, fellow Kenyans, I have made appointments of the following as Chief Administrative Secretaries. Hussein Dado, the Chief Secretary for Interior and Coordination of National Government. Patrick Olentutu, Chief Administrative Secretary for Labor and Social Protection. Andrew Timur, Chief Administrative Secretary for Water, Sanitation and Irrigation. Abdul Bahari, Chief Administrative Secretary for Devolution and ASAL. Lawrence Karanja, Chief Administrative Secretary for Industrialization, Trade and Enterprise Development. Peter Odoyo, Chief Administrative Secretary for Defense. Maureen Magoma Mbaka, Chief Administrative Secretary for ICT, Innovation and Youth Affairs. Winnie Gushu, Chief Administrative Secretary, the State Law Office. Wavinya Ndeti, Chief Administrative Secretary for Transport. Zakaria Kinuthia Mugure, Chief Administrative Secretary for Education. Mumina Bonaya, Chief Administrative Secretary for Education. Lina Chebi Kelimo, Chief Administrative Secretary for Agriculture, Livestock, Fisheries and Cooperatives. Ann Mukami Nyaga, Chief Administrative Secretary for Agriculture, Livestock, Fisheries and Cooperatives. Mercy Mwangi, Chief Administrative Secretary for Health. And finally, Nadia Ahmed Abdallah, Chief Administrative Secretary for ICT, Innovation